Sorry I'm busy. We'll celebrate another night. That was the last text my husband sent me before I watched him stand beneath the warm lights of an elegant downtown Chicago restaurant, lifting a crystal glass toward another woman with the kind of smile I hadn't seen in years. I didn't scream. I didn't march through the front door. I simply stood across the street, the cold evening breeze brushing against my face as every quiet sacrifice of the last 45 years suddenly took on a different meaning. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and until that Tuesday evening, I believed long marriages didn't end with shouting. I believed they faded slowly, hidden beneath routines, polite conversations, and unanswered questions. Charles and I had been married long enough to remember when our grocery bill was less than $50 a week, and every paycheck demanded careful planning. We built a life together from almost nothing. We bought our first little house after saving every extra dollar. We raised our son Nathan there. We celebrated birthdays around a scratched oak dining table that Charles promised he would never replace because it reminded him where we started. For decades, I believed those memories meant something to both of us. That afternoon had begun like so many others. I had spent the morning tending to my small backyard garden before driving across town for my annual eye appointment. On the way home, I stopped at Charles's favorite bakery and bought the pecan pie he always asked for whenever he had good news at work. He had mentioned earlier that week he might receive recognition for completing an important business project, and I thought a quiet dinner at home would be enough. It always had been for us. Around 4:30, I sent him a simple message asking what time he would be home. 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Sorry I'm busy. We'll celebrate another night. The words were ordinary, almost too ordinary, yet something about them felt strangely rehearsed, as though they had been written before I even asked the question. I tried to ignore the feeling. After all, successful people worked late. Deadlines happened. Meetings ran over. That was the explanation I offered myself while placing the pie carefully on the kitchen counter. But fate has a peculiar way of refusing comfortable lies. Less than 15 minutes later, I received a phone call from an old neighbor named Linda, who had no idea she was about to change my life forever. She mentioned she was celebrating her anniversary downtown, and casually asked whether Charles had finally convinced me to join him at the restaurant after all. I froze. Restaurant? I asked. There was a brief silence before she answered, sounding confused. Yes. I thought I just saw him through the front window. My heart didn't race. Oddly enough, it became perfectly still. I thanked her, grabbed my purse, and drove the 12 miles into the city without turning on the radio. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every mile felt like it carried me farther away from the woman I had been that morning. When I finally reached the restaurant, I parked across the street beneath a maple tree, whose leaves had already begun turning golden with the arrival of fall. Through the wide glass windows, I saw him immediately. Charles stood near the center of a beautifully decorated private dining room. He looked relaxed, confident, almost youthful. Across from him stood a woman with dark blonde hair wearing a navy dress that caught the soft candlelight. Charles lifted his glass toward her while everyone around them applauded. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile he had brought home every evening for years. This one reached his eyes. I quietly slipped my phone from my purse and captured a single photograph through the window before lowering it again. That was all I needed. I remained standing there for another few seconds, watching strangers celebrate a moment I was never meant to witness. Then I turned around, walked calmly back to my car, and drove home with the untouched pecan pie resting on the passenger seat beside me, realizing that sometimes the loudest betrayal arrives wrapped inside the quietest text message. I drove home more slowly than usual, not because traffic was heavy, but because I was afraid of arriving before I understood what I had just seen. The city lights blurred across my windshield as evening settled over Chicago, and every familiar street seemed strangely unfamiliar. The pecan pie remained untouched on the passenger seat, its sweet smell filling the car while my thoughts grew quieter instead of louder. I expected anger. I expected tears. Instead, there was only an unsettling calm, the kind that arrives when a puzzle finally reveals its picture. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the porch light had already turned on automatically, just as it had every evening for the past 12 years. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and paused in the silence. The house felt exactly the same. The family photographs still lined the hallway. Charles and I smiled from vacations in Maine, Arizona, and the Smoky Mountains. Nathan's graduation portrait still hung beside our wedding picture. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, and somehow that hurt more than anything else. I placed the pie on the kitchen counter exactly where I had intended to serve it earlier that evening. The dining table was already set for 2. White plates. Cloth napkins. The small candle I had planned to light remained unlit beside the salt and pepper shakers. I stared at the table for several seconds before quietly putting everything back into the cabinets. One plate at a time. One glass at a time. There was no rush. I had learned years ago that grief moved at its own pace. Around 9 o'clock, I heard Charles's car pull into the driveway. His footsteps sounded exactly as they always had, confident and familiar. He entered through the garage carrying his leather briefcase over one shoulder. "Long day," he said with a tired smile as he loosened his tie. The meeting ran much later than expected. I looked at him for a moment, wondering how many times those words had been rehearsed before reaching me. "That happens," I replied softly. He kissed my forehead with practiced ease before placing his keys in the ceramic bowl near the front door. The gesture was so automatic that it almost convinced me nothing had changed. Almost. "I am sorry about dinner," he continued while opening the refrigerator. "Maybe this weekend we can go somewhere nice." His eyes landed on the pecan pie. "You bought my favorite." "I did," I answered. "We can have it another time." He smiled with relief, apparently grateful that I had not asked questions. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and began talking about budgets, clients, and quarterly reports. I listened carefully, noticing details I had ignored for months. He never looked directly into my eyes while describing his evening. He checked his phone twice without opening any messages in front of me. When it vibrated a third time, he turned the screen face down before taking another sip of tea. They were tiny moments. Ordinary moments. Yet together they formed something impossible to overlook. After he went upstairs to shower, I remained alone in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background while I stood beside the sink looking into the dark window above it. My reflection looked older than it had that morning. Not weaker. Just different. I thought back over the past year. The unexpected business trips. The canceled anniversary dinner because of an urgent client meeting. The conference in Milwaukee that somehow required a new Navy sport coat. The evenings when Charles returned home smelling of an expensive perfume that was certainly not mine, explaining it away by saying someone had hugged him goodbye after a corporate event. Each memory had arrived separately, harmless enough to dismiss. Together they formed a story I had refused to read. I walked quietly into the living room and opened the drawer beneath the bookshelf where we kept household paperwork. Tax returns, insurance policies, bank statements, and warranty folders were stacked neatly inside. Charles had always insisted that organization prevented problems. Tonight, for the first time, I wondered whether organization could also hide them. I did not search through anything. Not yet. Instead, I closed the drawer, switched off the living room lamp, and climbed the stairs. Charles was already asleep, or pretending to be. His breathing remained slow and steady as I slipped into bed beside him. The distance between us measured less than 2 feet, yet it felt wider than Lake Michigan. I stared into the darkness, replaying the image of him raising that crystal glass toward Vivian Clark. I realized something then that frightened me far more than the betrayal itself. The photograph stored safely inside my phone was not the beginning of this story. It was simply the first page I had finally allowed myself to read. I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest any longer. Charles was still asleep beside me, facing the window exactly as he always did. For a moment I simply watched him, searching for the man I had married more than 4 decades earlier. The face was the same. The silver hair was the same. Even the faint lines around his eyes were familiar. Yet the trust one had carried for so many years was gone, and without it he looked like someone I barely knew. I quietly slipped out of bed, made myself a cup of coffee, and carried it onto the back patio. The September air was cool enough to require a light sweater, and the maple tree in our yard had already begun dropping small red leaves across the grass. I used to love mornings like this because they reminded me that life always moved forward with quiet certainty. That morning, however, Every falling leaf seemed to whisper that I had ignored too many signs for far too long. As I sat there, memories began arranging themselves in a completely different order. About 18 months earlier, Charles had started protecting his phone with the new passcode. When I joked that he must have become an international spy, he laughed and said the company requires stronger security because of confidential client information. I believed him without another question. A few months later, he suddenly became interested in buying new clothes. He had never cared much about fashion before. Yet he now owned tailored jackets, polished shoes, and expensive watches that he insisted were necessary for meeting important investors. I even complimented him, telling him he looked younger than ever. Looking back, I wondered who I had really been helping him impress. Then there were the business trips. They became more frequent but strangely shorter. Sometimes he would leave after breakfast and return before bedtime, claiming he had driven hundreds of miles in a single day for meetings that lasted only an hour. I accepted every explanation because trust had become a habit instead of a decision. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake. Trust should never become automatic. It should continue earning its place year after year. Around 8 o'clock, Charles came downstairs dressed for work. He smiled warmly as though the previous evening had been perfectly ordinary. He poured himself coffee, thanked me for making breakfast, and kissed my cheek before picking up his briefcase. "I might be late again tonight," he said while checking his watch. "The finance team is reviewing several investment proposals." I smiled back just enough to appear natural. "Drive safely," I answered. After the garage door closed behind him, I waited until his car disappeared from the end of the street before returning inside. The house felt unusually still. I carried my coffee into the home office where Charles often worked on weekends. His desk was spotless except for a leather portfolio lying neatly beside the computer monitor. I had no intention of invading his privacy. At least that was what I told myself. But then I remembered the photograph on my phone, and I realized that honesty had already left our marriage long before curiosity entered the room. I opened the portfolio. Most of the documents were ordinary business reports filled with charts and financial projections that meant very little to me. Then one folder caught my attention. It contained printed email confirmations for meetings with a financial consulting firm. The company name appeared several times, and beneath it was a familiar signature. Vivian Clark. My heartbeat remained surprisingly steady as I continued reading. She was listed as a senior financial advisor assigned directly to Charles's personal investment strategy. Several meetings had taken place outside regular office hours. Dinner appointments, weekend consultations, private planning sessions. Perhaps every meeting had been entirely professional. Perhaps not. But I had stood outside that restaurant window the night before, and I had seen something no spreadsheet could explain. I carefully returned every document exactly where I had found it, closed the portfolio, and stepped away from the desk. I was no longer searching for proof that something had changed. I was beginning to understand that the real question was how much had already changed without me ever noticing. I spent the next 2 days pretending nothing had changed. It surprised even me how naturally I could smile across the breakfast table, ask Charles whether he wanted more coffee, and remind him that Nathan had called to ask if we would visit next weekend. Charles answered each question with the same calm confidence he always had, completely unaware that every ordinary conversation had become another opportunity for me to observe instead of believe. I stopped searching for dramatic mistakes because I realized deception rarely announces itself. It lives inside habits, tiny inconsistencies, and moments people think no one notices. On Thursday afternoon, I decided to organize the filing cabinet in the home office, something I had postponed for months. Charles had always teased me for keeping every receipt and warranty in labeled folders, saying I could probably find paperwork from our first washing machine if I really wanted to. That afternoon, my careful habits rewarded me. Buried beneath several tax documents was a large envelope from our investment firm. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier, but it had already been opened. Normally, Charles and I reviewed financial statements together, because nearly every account had been built with money we had earned during our marriage. This time, however, I had never seen the envelope before. Inside were summaries of several investment accounts. Most of them looked familiar until I reached the final pages. There was a reference to a proposed family trust that included updated beneficiary recommendations. The proposal had not yet been finalized, but someone had clearly begun preparing the paperwork. Charles's name appeared throughout the documents. So did Vivian Clark's signature as the financial advisor overseeing the planning process. I slowly lowered the papers onto the desk. My first reaction was not jealousy. It was confusion. Why had Charles never mentioned changing our estate plan? We had always promised each other that every important financial decision would be discussed together. When Nathan graduated from college, we updated our wills together. When we refinanced the house, we sat side by side with the attorney. Even after retirement, we continued reviewing our investments every spring over coffee at the kitchen table. That tradition had quietly disappeared, and somehow I had accepted its absence without asking why. I reached for an older folder containing estate documents from 6 years earlier. The difference was impossible to ignore. Every signature had belonged to both of us. Every decision reflected shared planning. The new proposal carried only Charles's instructions. My name appeared only where legally required. It felt as though I had slowly become a footnote inside the life we had spent decades building together. I carefully returned every page to its proper place. I was determined that nothing in the office would reveal I had been there. Then I noticed a small business card tucked inside the envelope. It belonged to Vivian. On the back, written in neat blue ink, were 6 simple words. Looking forward to celebrating our success soon. There was no date. No explanation. Standing alone, the sentence could have described nothing more than a completed financial project. Yet paired with the image still saved on my phone, those words settled heavily in my mind. I slipped my phone from my pocket and looked again at the photograph I had taken through the restaurant window. Charles was smiling toward Vivian while raising his glass. Around them, several people appeared to be applauding. It could have been a company celebration. Could have been an award dinner. But after 45 years of marriage, I knew the difference between Charles's polite professional smile and the expression he reserved for moments that mattered personally. This had not been business alone. Late that evening, Charles returned home carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. White lilies. My favorites. He handed them to me with an apologetic smile and said he felt guilty for working so many late nights recently. I thanked him sincerely because the flowers were beautiful. As I placed them into a crystal vase filled with fresh water, I realized something that made my heart unexpectedly peaceful. Guilt often inspires generous gestures, but honesty never needs to disguise itself. I arranged the flowers carefully on the dining table, admired them for a quiet moment, and silently accepted that I was no longer trying to save my marriage. I was trying to understand the truth before anyone else realized that I had already begun looking for it. I waited until Monday morning before taking the next step. I wanted the weekend to pass naturally, giving myself enough time to separate emotion from judgment. By then, I no longer felt driven by hurt. I felt driven by clarity. Charles left the house shortly after 8 o'clock, saying he had an early strategy meeting with several executives from the investment firm. He kissed my cheek before walking out the door, exactly as he always had. I watched his car disappear around the corner, then returned to the kitchen, finished my coffee, and picked up the business card I had quietly slipped into my purse 2 days earlier. Martin Keller, the attorney who had helped Charles and me draft our estate plan years ago. His office was only 25 minutes from our neighborhood, tucked inside a historic brick building overlooking the Chicago River. I called his receptionist and asked whether he might have a few minutes available that afternoon. To my surprise, she remembered my name immediately and told me Mr. Keller would make time for me. By 1 o'clock, I was sitting across from him in the same conference room where Charles and I had once laughed about finally becoming responsible adults after signing our wills. Martin looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair, but his calm expression had not changed. He greeted me warmly, asked about my retirement, and spoke kindly about Nathan. I smiled politely before placing my phone on the table. Without saying a word, I opened the photograph I had taken outside the restaurant and turned the screen toward him. He studied it silently. Then I placed the investment proposal beside the phone, followed by the business card bearing Vivian Clark's handwritten message. Martin folded his hands together and remained quiet for several moments. Finally, he looked at me with the careful expression of someone choosing every word with precision. "Eleanor," he said gently, "what would you like me to help you understand?" I appreciated that he did not jump to conclusions. He did not criticize Charles. He simply asked what I needed. I want to know whether anything important can be changed without my knowledge, I answered. Not because I want revenge. Because I need the truth. Martin nodded slowly. He explained that while every family's legal situation differed, significant changes involving jointly owned marital assets often required careful legal review. He also explained that draft proposals were not necessarily completed transactions. However, he agreed that if long-established financial planning had suddenly become secretive, it deserved closer attention. He reviewed the copies I had brought with me, making a few notes before pausing at Vivian's signature. She appears to be acting as the financial advisor on these proposed changes, he said. That alone is not unusual. But if communication has stopped between spouses regarding long-standing financial decisions, it raises important questions. I listened without interrupting. Facts were strangely comforting. They carried none of the sharp edges that assumptions did. Martin recommended requesting updated statements directly from every financial institution where Charles and I held joint accounts. As a joint account holder, I had every right to understand the current status of our shared finances. He also suggested creating copies of important household records before discussing anything with Charles. Knowledge first, he said quietly. Conversations second. Before leaving, I asked him one final question. If you were me, would you confront him today? Martin leaned back thoughtfully before answering. No. I would not confront anyone until I understood the complete picture. Once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. But information has a way of revealing what emotions often hide. I thanked him sincerely and walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in days. The afternoon sun reflected off the river, and for the first time since that evening outside the restaurant, I realized I was no longer walking through this alone. I had not hired an attorney to fight my husband. I had asked an experienced professional to help me understand my own life again. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a new message from Charles. He wrote that another late meeting had come up and asked if I would mind eating dinner without him. I smiled gently, set the phone back onto the passenger seat without replying immediately, and continued driving, knowing that while Charles believed he was gaining more time, every hour he spent hiding the truth was quietly giving me exactly what I needed. I followed Martin's advice with almost surprising ease because it required patience rather than confrontation, and patience had been part of my life for decades. Every morning unfolded exactly as it always had. I prepared breakfast before Charles came downstairs. I asked whether he wanted eggs or oatmeal. I reminded him to bring a light jacket whenever the weather forecast predicted cooler temperatures along the lake. He thanked me with the comfortable familiarity of a husband who believed his routine remained completely unchanged. If he noticed anything different about me, he never mentioned it. Perhaps he mistook my silence for acceptance. In reality, my silence had become observation. The following Wednesday, I visited our bank branch after running a few ordinary errands. I deposited a birthday check my sister had mailed the previous week, and then requested updated statements for every account that carried both Charles's name and mine. The bank representative recognized me immediately because we had worked with her for years. She printed the statements without hesitation and wished me a pleasant afternoon. Nothing about the visit felt dramatic. It was simply a wife reviewing financial records that legally belonged to both spouses. Yet by the time I reached my car, I held more answers than I had expected. Most of our accounts appeared stable, exactly as they should have been. Mortgage payments had long since ended. Utility bills continued arriving on schedule. Retirement income was deposited every month. But one investment account showed several unusually large transfers over the previous 6 months into a newly established financial portfolio that I did not recognize. The transfers themselves were not illegal. They simply had never been discussed with me. I drove to a nearby park instead of going straight home. Sitting on a wooden bench overlooking a quiet pond, I carefully compared the bank statements with the investment proposal I had copied from Charles's office. The account numbers matched. The dates aligned almost perfectly with the planning meetings listed beside Vivian Clark's name. My heartbeat remained steady. I had expected confusion. Instead, I felt certainty slowly replacing doubt. That evening, Charles arrived home carrying takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. "I thought neither of us would feel like cooking tonight," he said cheerfully while setting the bags on the kitchen counter. We ate together, discussing Nathan's upcoming business trip, neighborhood news, and whether we should replace the aging patio furniture before next spring. Charles laughed easily throughout dinner. If guilt weighed on him, he carried it remarkably well. At one point he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We should plan a vacation," he said. "Maybe somewhere on the coast after the holidays. It has been too long." I looked into his eyes and smiled gently. Years earlier, those words would have filled me with excitement. Now they sounded like someone trying to preserve a picture whose frame had already cracked. "That sounds nice," I replied quietly. After dinner, while Charles watched the evening news in the family room, I excused myself and walked upstairs with the excuse of organizing old photographs. Instead, I opened a small fireproof box stored on the top shelf of our bedroom closet. Inside were copies of our marriage certificate, property deed, insurance policies, tax returns, and every estate planning document Martin had prepared over the years. I carefully made digital copies of everything and stored them on a secure flash drive before returning every page exactly as I had found it. The process took less than an hour, yet it felt as though I had quietly reclaimed part of my own voice. Before going to bed, I stood alone at the bedroom window watching the porch light cast its familiar glow across the front yard. The house looked peaceful from the outside, just as it always had. Neighbors driving past would have seen nothing unusual. They would have assumed an ordinary retired couple lived inside, sharing quiet evenings and planning future vacations. I almost smiled at the thought. Appearances could remain perfectly intact, even while the truth shifted beneath them. Charles believed he was protecting a carefully constructed secret. He did not realize that every ordinary day he spent pretending had become another day for me to prepare calmly, think clearly, and understand exactly where our shared life had begun to separate into two very different stories. I thought I had seen every surprise our marriage had left to offer until Charles mentioned the anniversary dinner. We would celebrate 45 years together the following Friday, and he suggested inviting a few close friends along with several people from his investment circle. He said it would be nice to combine a personal celebration with an opportunity to thank those who had helped him prepare for retirement. I smiled and agreed without hesitation. If anything, his invitation confirmed that he still believed I knew nothing. Throughout the week, he spoke enthusiastically about the dinner, carefully selecting the restaurant, discussing the menu, and even asking whether I planned to wear the pearl necklace he had given me on our 30th anniversary. I answered every question with the same quiet warmth I had always shown him. Inside, however, I was paying attention to every new detail. 2 days before the event, I received an unexpected telephone call from Martin Keller. He had completed the review of several public records connected to the investment documents I had shown him. There was nothing illegal about the transactions he had examined, but he had discovered that the proposed trust documents had advanced much further than Charles had admitted. Drafts had already been circulated between financial advisors, and additional review meetings had been scheduled. Martin reminded me once again not to rush into accusations. Facts carried far greater weight than emotions. Before ending the call, he asked a simple question. "Do you intend to attend the dinner?" I looked out the kitchen window toward the garden Charles and I had planted almost 20 years earlier. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I think I should be there." Friday evening arrived with unusually pleasant autumn weather. I chose an ivory dress that had remained in my closet since Nathan's wedding reception several years earlier. It was elegant without being extravagant, and it reminded me of a version of myself who had once entered every room believing she belonged there. I fastened the pearl necklace around my neck, styled my silver hair carefully, and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me no longer appeared uncertain. She looked composed. When Charles came downstairs, he stopped for a brief moment and smiled with genuine admiration. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly. "Thank you," I replied. "So do you." The drive downtown felt surprisingly comfortable. Charles chatted about traffic, the weather forecast, and a recent baseball game while soft jazz played through the car speakers. Anyone watching us would have seen an ordinary couple heading toward a joyful celebration. In many ways, that image still existed. It simply no longer reflected the truth beneath it. The private dining room had already begun filling with guests when we arrived. Friends greeted us warmly. Several former colleagues congratulated us on reaching such a remarkable milestone together. I accepted every hug and every kind word with sincere gratitude, because none of those people had caused my pain. Then I noticed Vivian Clark standing near the far side of the room speaking with two executives from the investment firm. She wore a dark emerald dress and carried herself with quiet confidence. When her eyes met mine across the room, she smiled politely, the kind of courteous expression professionals exchange at formal events. If she felt uncomfortable seeing me there, she concealed it well. Charles guided me toward the group and introduced me with obvious pride. "You have met my wife Eleanor before," he said pleasantly. Vivian extended her hand without hesitation. "It is wonderful to see you again," she said. I shook her hand gently and returned her smile. "Likewise," I answered. For a brief second, I noticed Charles studying both of us as though relieved the introduction had passed without awkwardness. He had no idea that I already knew far more than either of them imagined. As conversations continued around the room and servers quietly filled crystal glasses with sparkling cider and wine, I realized the evening had reached a turning point. Everyone believed they were gathering to celebrate a long and successful marriage. Only I understood that before the night was over, appearances would no longer be enough to hold the truth together. The dinner moved gracefully from one conversation to another until the restaurant manager tapped a spoon against his glass and welcomed everyone. Soft applause filled the room as the first course was served, followed by warm laughter that echoed beneath the elegant chandeliers. I looked around the table at familiar faces, many of whom had known Charles and me for decades. They had celebrated our victories, comforted us through losses, and watched our family grow. None of them deserved to become part of an uncomfortable scene. That realization strengthened my resolve. I was not there to embarrass anyone. I was there to stop pretending. After dessert plates were cleared away, one of Charles's colleagues stood and congratulated us on 45 years of marriage. He spoke kindly about commitment, partnership, and the example we had supposedly set for younger couples. When he finished, everyone applauded once more. Charles rose with a warm smile and thanked the guests for coming. He spoke about perseverance, shared dreams, and how fortunate he had been to spend his life beside someone who had supported every chapter of his career. His words were polished, thoughtful, and almost convincing. If I had not known everything I now knew, I might have believed every sentence. Then he lifted his glass toward me. "To Eleanor," he said, "for always believing in me." Crystal glasses rose throughout the room. I smiled gently, lifted my own glass, and waited until the applause faded. "May I say a few words?" I asked. Charles nodded immediately. "Of course." I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my ivory dress before looking around the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began. "Many of you have shared important moments with our family over the years, and I truly appreciate your friendship." The room grew quiet. Marriage teaches many lessons. One of the most important is that trust is built through honesty, not simply through time. Charles continued smiling, although I noticed a brief uncertainty cross his face. I reached into my handbag and removed my phone. With a calm touch, I opened the photograph I had taken outside the restaurant and held the screen where Charles could see it first. The color slowly drained from his face. I then turned the phone toward the center of the table so those nearest us could understand why the room had suddenly become silent. Nobody spoke. There was only the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of dishes from the kitchen. I placed the phone beside my plate before removing several neatly organized copies of the investment proposal from my folder. "Over the past few weeks," I said evenly, "I learned that significant financial decisions concerning our shared future were being prepared without my knowledge. I also discovered meetings and celebrations that I was never told about. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing beyond what I could personally verify. I simply presented the facts I had confirmed. My voice never rose. My hands never shook. Vivian remained completely still, looking down at the documents in front of her. Charles opened his mouth several times, searching for words that refused to arrive. Finally, he whispered, "Eleanor, this is not the place." I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had carried all evening. "You are right," I answered quietly. "The proper place would have been our kitchen table before these decisions were ever made." No one interrupted. No one argued. The silence itself carried more weight than any raised voice could have managed. I gathered the papers together once more and slipped them back into my handbag. I am not asking anyone here to choose sides, I continued. I simply believe that honesty deserves the same audience that secrecy has already enjoyed. I offered a polite smile to the guests who had shown us kindness for so many years. Then I took a slow breath, looked once more at Charles, and realized that the hardest part of telling the truth was not speaking it. The hardest part was finally accepting that the life I had spent decades protecting had quietly changed long before I found the courage to acknowledge it. When I finished speaking, I did not wait for applause, explanations, or apologies. I simply picked up my handbag, thanked the restaurant staff for their kindness, and walked toward the exit with the same steady pace I had used when I entered. Behind me, I could hear quiet conversations beginning to ripple across the room, but I never turned around. Some moments deserve witnesses. Others deserve distance. Outside, the crisp evening air felt lighter than it had in weeks. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the reflections of the city lights dancing across the river. For the first time since that unexpected text message, I realized my heart was no longer racing. It was finally resting. A few minutes later, my phone began to ring. Charles. I watched his name appear on the screen until the call ended. Then another call came. I let that one pass as well. A message followed almost immediately. Please come back. We need to talk. I slipped the phone into my purse without reading anything further. We had needed to talk weeks earlier, before hidden meetings, secret financial plans, and carefully rehearsed excuses became part of our marriage. Silence had protected him for a long time. Tonight it was protecting me. The following morning, I met Martin Keller at his office once again. We reviewed every document I had gathered, along with the updated financial statements from our bank. Martin carefully explained each option available to me, and reminded me that every future decision should be made thoughtfully rather than emotionally. Together, we prepared formal requests to pause any pending changes involving jointly owned assets until every necessary review had been completed. Everything was handled through the proper legal process, calmly and respectfully. There were no dramatic confrontations, only clear documentation and careful decisions. Later that afternoon, Charles returned home much earlier than usual. He was sitting on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway. He stood as I stepped from my car, looking older than he had only 24 hours before. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded. We sat together at the patio table where we had shared countless cups of coffee over the years. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Charles admitted that he had allowed professional boundaries to become blurred while working closely with Vivian. He insisted that many of the financial discussions had begun as legitimate planning sessions, but acknowledged that he should never have excluded me from decisions that affected our future. He apologized for the secrecy, for the lies, and for allowing distance to replace honesty. I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear every word before deciding what they meant. When he finished, I folded my hands together and answered as calmly as I could. The hardest part is not what happened. The hardest part is realizing that you stopped treating me like your partner long before I discovered any evidence. He lowered his eyes, unable to disagree. Over the next several weeks, practical matters moved forward one step at a time. Financial accounts were reviewed. Estate planning documents were corrected where necessary. Every decision was made transparently, with professional guidance and written records. Nathan eventually learned that his father and I were facing difficult conversations. He did not demand explanations or assign blame. Instead, he hugged me a little longer than usual, and reminded me that I would always have a place in his life. Those words meant more than he could have known. Winter arrived quietly that year. One snowy morning, I stood by the living room window watching fresh snow settle across the front yard. The same house still surrounded me. The same family photographs still decorated the hallway. Yet everything felt different because I no longer measured my worth by someone else's choices. I had spent decades believing that protecting peace required remaining silent. I finally understood that real peace begins when honesty is no longer postponed. Sometimes people ask me when my marriage truly changed. They expect me to name the evening outside that restaurant or the anniversary dinner where the truth finally surfaced. But I think it changed much earlier. In all the small moments when difficult conversations were replaced with convenient excuses. Those little moments built invisible walls one brick at a time. Looking back now, I do not regret choosing dignity over anger. I do not regret speaking calmly instead of loudly. Truth does not become stronger because it is shouted. It becomes stronger because it remains true even after the room grows quiet. And as I poured myself another cup of coffee that peaceful winter morning, I smiled gently, not because everything had been repaired, but because I had finally learned that losing an illusion is sometimes the first step toward finding yourself again.